Has anyone ever told you that you were the problem, just to avoid blame?
I asked my mom if she could help me with tuition, and the way she looked at me still stings, because it wasn't just the words she used, it was the way her eyes carried that rehearsed pity I had seen so many times before. The kind of look that makes you feel small before you've even finished your sentence. She sighed, shifted in her chair, and told me, almost like she had practiced it in her head 100 times, that they just weren't financially stable right now, that things were tight, that I would have to figure it out on my own. And in that moment, I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind her how hard I had been working, how I wasn't asking for luxuries or even comfort, just a little bit of help to cover the gaps so I could stay in school without drowning in stress. But I knew exactly what would happen if I pushed. She would turn it into a lecture about independence and sacrifice, about how life isn't fair, about how everyone has to struggle at some point, and I would end up apologizing for even opening my mouth. So instead, I just sat there, nodded like I understood, and swallowed every single thing I wanted to say, because the truth was I did understand, just not in the way she meant. What I understood was that my parents had a pattern, one that had been there for as long as I could remember, where I was expected to take the harder road because supposedly it built character, while my brother was handed smooth pavement and signposts with his name on them. Growing up, it was little things, like who got the bigger slice of cake or the louder applause at a recital, but the older we got, the more obvious it became, and the more it hurt. So when I heard those words, "We're just not financially stable," what I really heard was that my education, my future, and my stability simply didn't rank high enough on their list of priorities. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about what unstable really meant in our house, because sure, bills were there, like they are for everyone, but I had seen the way they shopped, the vacations they took, the way money always seemed to materialize for my brother's wants. I started to realize that unstable was a word my parents used like a shield, a way of ending conversations they didn't want to have, a way of making me feel guilty for even asking. And even though I tried to tell myself to let it go, I couldn't. The resentment sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold, and every time I replayed the conversation in my head, I found myself biting down on the inside of my cheek just to keep from yelling. I still tried to keep up appearances though, because that's what you do when you grow up in a house where one child is the golden one and the other is expected to quietly manage. At dinner I smiled, I asked about their day, I even congratulated my brother when he bragged about some new hobby he was going to get into, knowing full well that within weeks my parents would funnel money into it, because that's just how it worked. I didn't bring up tuition again. I didn't even mention it when friends asked if my family was helping. I told them I was figuring it out, and in a way, I was. I just hadn't decided yet how exactly I was going to do it. But if I'm being honest, underneath the anger and the frustration, there was still this small piece of me that hoped maybe my mom would circle back. Maybe she'd come into my room late at night and say she had thought about it, that she didn't want me to worry so much, that they would find a way to help after all. That's the part of me that always wanted to believe she cared in the same way about me as she did about him, that maybe things weren't as uneven as they always felt. But weeks went by, and the conversation never came. If anything, they acted as though I had never asked at all. I remember one morning, I walked into the kitchen, and they were both at the table, laughing about something my brother had said, their whole world orbiting around him like always, and I thought to myself, this is it. This is the reality. And no matter how much it hurts, I have to stop expecting it to change. I knew then that I couldn't wait around for fairness, that if I wanted a future that belonged to me, I was going to have to carve it out myself, without asking for permission, without expecting their support. And I could have left it there, I could have accepted it as just another disappointing chapter in a long book of favoritism. But then, 1 month later, I found out exactly what unstable meant in their vocabulary. And it hit me harder than any lecture or excuse ever could. 1 month after that conversation where I promised myself I would not beg again, I was making coffee and trying to decide whether I could stretch the same bag another week when my brother strolled in humming and dropped a line so casual it sounded rehearsed, telling me he was supposed to keep it quiet, but that I should keep next Saturday free because there was going to be a little family thing at the marina, which would have been a strange sentence in any other house, but in ours translated to one very specific truth, that my parents' version of financial instability somehow came with dock space and a celebratory ribbon. I did not confront him, and I did not ask for details, because I have learned that when you ask questions in my family, you only end up feeding their script. So I just nodded and pretended I was trying to remember whether I had plans. While inside my head, I was laying out all the moments that had led to this one. The birthdays where he got the big gifts and I got the meaningful ones. The weekends where he was excused from chores because he had a game while I was told that good daughters pitch in. Without keeping score, the times money appeared for his hobbies like magic, while my practical needs were treated like character tests I was supposed to pass with a smile. The reveal arrived the way our reveals always do, not with honesty but with theater. And at the marina, my mom linked her arm through his and said she was so proud of how hard he had been working and how a person needs an outlet to decompress from the pressure of adulthood. And my dad explained the numbers in that voice he uses when he wants to sound responsible, saying the boat was pre-owned and the financing was shockingly good and that they were getting a deal of a lifetime, and I stood there, on the edge of their joy, thinking about the word unstable and how well it covered hypocrisy when you needed it to. My brother, who has never met a mirror he does not trust, asked me what he should name it, and when I did not answer fast enough, he floated a few options that sounded like motivational posters. And my mom laughed and said he deserved something that felt like a reward after such a tough year, and I thought about my own year, about the nights I stayed up tutoring for extra cash, and the mornings I took early shifts, and the afternoons I skipped meals to make numbers work. And I realized that whatever ledger they kept in their heads had never once counted my effort as anything other than expected. On the drive home, my dad gave a speech about timing and priorities and how sometimes a family has to make choices, and I sat in the back seat staring straight ahead while my mom turned around and squeezed my knee and told me she wished they could do more for me. And I answered with something neutral that sounded like gratitude, because I no longer had the energy to police their stories when my energy would be better spent building my own. That night, I opened my laptop and pulled up an email I had been ignoring because something in me still wanted my parents to come through at the last minute. The one from the financial aid office reminding students about late scholarship windows and departmental awards that rarely get enough applicants, and I felt the tightness in my chest loosen as I read through the requirements. Because every single line item sounded like it had been written for a person like me who had done the work without a parade. I printed what needed to be printed, and I wrote what needed to be written, and when the essay prompt asked me to describe a moment that changed my outlook, I did not mention the boat or the dock or the way my mom's voice goes soft when she is justifying something that should embarrass her. I talked about learning to stop asking for permission to become the person I already was. And I wrote until the anger burned down into something cleaner and steadier that sounded a lot like resolve. The next week, I visited the financial aid office between classes, and the woman at the desk who always remembers names walked me through the stack and pointed to places where students usually mess up. And I listened carefully and triple-checked each section and handed over the packet with the kind of calm that does not look dramatic on the outside, but feels like a door closing and another one opening. And when she told me the timeline, I thanked her and kept my smile small because I had no intention of broadcasting anything to anyone until there was something worth broadcasting. At home, I played my role with the same quiet accuracy I have been perfecting since childhood, asking polite questions about the boat and nodding through my mom's gentle remarks about how she wished circumstances were different. And I kept my own circumstances to myself because I wanted the reveal to be mine, not as a punishment or a gotcha, but as a statement that I could build a future without their permission slips and still make the room notice. When the acceptance came through, it did not arrive with confetti or a drum roll, just an email and a letter and a meeting invitation that spelled out terms so generous I had to read them twice. And I sat on the edge of my bed with the paper in my hands, thinking about how the story I had been assigned in this family was not the story I had to live, and how sometimes the quiet choice is not weakness, but strategy. I did not run to the kitchen waving proof or call my mom at work because I understood that the strongest answer is the one that takes its time, so I filed the papers, confirmed every step, and started planning a future that did not hinge on anyone's fragile version of stability, while my brother posted photos of weekend rides and my parents liked every single one. And I kept my mouth shut and my head down and let them believe I was still treading water. And while Ethan was busy christening his shiny new definition of need and my parents were busy clapping for themselves, I was busy signing something else entirely, something that would not float for a season, but carry me a very long way. And the moment they realized it was coming faster than they could imagine. When the acceptance settled into something real rather than a hopeful email I was scared to trust, I sat with the papers and read every line out loud to myself like a contract with the person I kept claiming I wanted to become, and as the terms unfolded, with tuition covered and a stipend that would not make me rich but would make me steady, I felt that tight knot I had been carrying since the word unstable first landed begin to loosen in a way that felt less like relief and more like the beginning of a plan that did not need an announcement to be powerful. I walked back to the financial aid office with the kind of calm that looks ordinary to anyone not paying attention, thanked the advisor who had guided me through the maze without a hint of condescension, signed the acceptance where the tabs told me to sign, and chose, with the same deliberate restraint I have learned to use at our dinner table, to keep every detail to myself, because there is a particular kind of power in silence when the people around you prefer the noise of their own stories, and will fill any quiet with whatever makes them look generous, responsible, and put upon. Over the next week, I answered my mom's soft check-ins with careful phrases that sounded like I was holding it together by a thread, a performance that never required lies because all I had to do was leave out the parts that would have made her uncomfortable. And when my dad lectured me about budgeting and grit while he checked weather updates for the marina, I nodded, made a joke about learning to live on instant noodles again, and took mental notes about how completely they had convinced themselves that denying help was a noble act rather than a convenient choice. In that in-between space, when the scholarship was secure and the semester calendar was turning toward graduation, I got an unexpected email from the university communications office about a donor campaign that would highlight first-generation and high-achieving students on local billboards during commencement week. And while the old version of me would have forwarded it to my parents with a nervous caption asking if it was too much, the newer version replied within minutes with a yes and a short interview about my program, my work hours, and the faculty member who had pushed me to apply when I was half sure it was pointless, because if there was ever a moment designed to let truth speak for itself, this was it. They asked for a photo session and a release. They asked me to approve a simple line about a full scholarship and post-graduation plans, and they asked whether I had any location preferences, which is how I found myself looking at a map of our town like a strategist rather than a daughter, circling the stretch of road my parents take every time they leave the neighborhood for the interstate, a straight, unavoidable path that would place my face and those clean, unarguable words right above the turn where my dad always reminds my mom to merge early because he does not like surprises, and I wrote back with a polite suggestion that I thought the eastbound route would be meaningful since so many families would use it on their way to the ceremony. The photographer was kind and fast and did not try to make me into someone I was not, and the copywriter kept the text as plain as a cut sheet, just my name, the scholarship title, and a line about the department. And when they asked if I wanted anything added, I shook my head and told them simple was best, because I was not interested in gloating or rubbing salt into anything. I was interested in making sure the people who had spent months performing sacrifice while funding a floating toy were forced to sit in a moment where the story did not bend to their convenience. At home, I played my familiar role with almost comic accuracy, listening to updates about the boat's first long outing and the cooler my mom found on sale, and the brilliant way my dad negotiated for an extra season of storage. And I kept my tone warm and my face neutral while I scheduled my final meeting with the communications team, because I understood that revenge delivered as spectacle usually looks childish, while revenge delivered as reality looks undeniable and, frankly, educational. There were flickers of guilt, because there always are when you have been raised to believe that keeping peace is the same thing as being good, and on a late night when the house was quiet, I asked myself whether the billboard was petty. And I landed on a truth that did not wave flags or demand applause, that what hurt me was not the money itself, but the story my parents kept telling, the one where I should be grateful for the tough love and resilience training they had generously assigned me. And that allowing a different story to exist in public, without argument and without commentary, was not cruelty, it was clarity. The final confirmation arrived 2 weeks before commencement with a proof to approve and an installation schedule that said the board would go live at 6 in the morning on graduation day, which meant there would be no chance for quiet edits or panicked calls to take it down, and I stared at the mock-up until I could recite every pixel from memory. Then typed the most careful yes I have ever typed in my life and closed my laptop with hands that felt steady rather than shaking, because the point was not to surprise them for the thrill of it. The point was to let them meet the truth the same way everyone else would. I did not change our plans or announce any special breakfast stops. I simply suggested we leave early to avoid traffic and offered to drive so they could relax. And when my mom smiled and said she liked that idea and my dad said an early start proved I had finally learned something about planning, I bit down on the small laugh that wanted to escape. Because the only thing left between the life they insisted on narrating and the life I was actually living was a straight piece of road and a rectangle of vinyl that would do all the talking I no longer felt obligated to do. And as we packed the garment bag and the silly cap and the careful tone for a day that was supposed to be about family pride, I told myself that if they insisted on lessons, then this one would be taught in letters high enough to read from the far lane. In the weeks between the quiet confirmation of the scholarship and the day when everything would tilt, I learned to wear patience like a second skin, because even though it would have felt good to throw the truth onto the table and watch the performance end, there was something cleaner and far more satisfying about letting their version of events burn itself out while I kept feeding mine with small, deliberate choices that no one noticed until the moment they did, and in that strange, suspended time my mother perfected her soft little laments about wishing they could do more while buying new cushions for the boat seats, because comfort matters when you are out on the water. And my father found 6 different ways to explain how a pre-owned purchase was actually a responsible investment that would pay for itself in family memories. And my brother filmed entire lectures about marina etiquette for his social feed while texting me to ask if I could pick up ice since he was swamped with planning, as though my time had always been a pantry he could open without knocking. I kept my head down, but it was not submission anymore, it was choreography, because every day had a tiny task that moved the plan forward while keeping theirs intact, and if that meant answering my mother's, "How are you holding up?" with language that sounded resilient and frazzled at the same time, or nodding through my father's budgeting speeches while I organized final documents for a future he still believed I was too naive to secure, then that was simply the cost of admission for the ending I wanted. And although a small voice inside me sometimes asked whether I was being petty, another, steadier voice reminded me that pretending your child's struggle builds character, while funding another child's leisure builds resentment. And that I was done paying that bill in silence just so everyone else could stay comfortable. There were moments when I almost slipped, like the department reception where a professor hugged me too long and said she could not wait to see my name on that board. And I had to steer the conversation toward coursework because my mother was standing 3 feet away pretending to be fascinated by a tray of cookies while listening with both ears. Or the afternoon my brother tossed me his keys and asked me to run the new registration to the marina because he was slammed and I could use the fresh air, and I had to stop myself from asking whether he had ever once looked at my calendar before assuming his convenience was my duty, but I took the keys and handled it because every errand turned their confidence into a deeper sleep. And sleeping people never see the turn coming. When the communications office sent a final check-in about the installation timeline and asked if my family would be comfortable with the placement, I read the email 3 times, laughed without smiling, and wrote back that the location was perfect and the timing was ideal, and then, because I am not cruel but I am thorough, I suggested a minor copy edit that removed the cheerful exclamation point after the phrase full scholarship and replaced it with a short period, since I wanted the line to land with the weight of a fact rather than the bounce of a billboard, and their editor agreed so quickly that I had to sit down and breathe for a minute, because there is a sharp difference between proving a point and letting a point prove itself, and I wanted the latter. At home, I volunteered to handle the only part of graduation my parents dread, which is the parking pass and the route, and I did it with the voice I use when I want them to think they have given me a useful assignment. And I printed maps and highlighted turns and offered to drive so my father could relax and my mother could enjoy the morning. And when they praised my initiative like it was a new development rather than a survival tactic I had honed for years, I smiled and asked if we could leave a little earlier just to keep stress low, because the lots fill fast and I would hate for us to be late, and they agreed without a second of suspicion. Too pleased by how easy I was making their day to notice that they were handing me the wheel to the one part that mattered. The night before the ceremony, my mother ironed my gown and told me how proud she was of my resilience, a word she loves because it allows her to compliment me for surviving something she refused to fix. And my father rehearsed a speech about how sacrifice is misunderstood by young people who want shortcuts, and my brother asked whether we could swing by the marina after since the weather looked good for a victory lap. And I said that sounded nice because I have learned that nothing ruins a perfect reveal faster than a pregame argument, and then I went to my room and set 3 alarms, printed a spare confirmation just in case, and texted the communications coordinator to thank her for all the help. Because when you are building an ending that depends on timing, kindness is as much a tool as anger. I did not sleep much, but I did not need to, since I was long past the point of shaking hands or second thoughts, and when the sky finally tilted toward morning and the house started to clatter with coffee and keys and casual chatter about the best photo spots, I took the wheel with the sort of calm that comes from knowing the route better than anyone else in the car, merged onto the eastbound lane that I had chosen for them months ago, and kept my voice light as I asked my dad if this speed worked for him, because in a handful of quiet miles a rectangle of vinyl would end a conversation I had been losing since childhood, and I intended to let it speak without a single extra word from me. I took the wheel because that had been the plan from the moment the proof arrived in my inbox, and as we slid onto the eastbound lane in the soft rush of early traffic, I kept my voice easy, while my dad commented on how smart it was to leave before the crowds. And my mom listed the photos she wanted after the ceremony, and my brother in the back seat suggested a late lunch near the marina as if the day were already divided into his favorite parts, yet the only clock I was watching was the set time for installation, which the coordinator had confirmed would be done by sunrise, so when the road opened and the long spine of billboards began, I settled into the right lane, eased off the gas exactly where I knew the view would be clean, and told a story about parking lots just to keep their eyes forward until the board rose into full sight, and there it was, my name in tall, quiet letters, the scholarship title laid out like a fact no one could argue with, and a short line about the department and post-graduation plans that did not ask for applause, because it did not need any. My dad saw it first and made the smallest sound, the same sound he makes when a driver in front of him forgets to signal, and he hit the blinker without thinking, merging too early like he always does when something unsettles him. While my mom pressed her hand to her chest in that reflex she has when she wants to look moved and dignified at the same time, except the look that washed across her face was not dignity. It was recognition followed by the kind of calculation she saves for moments when she needs a narrative that does not make her look bad, and in the back seat my brother leaned forward and read the line out loud as if testing whether the words would change if he said them, then sat back and, in a voice he probably thought sounded supportive, asked how long I had known, and I kept my eyes on the lane and told him the truth without adding decoration, that I had signed the papers weeks ago and chosen to say nothing, because sometimes the simplest sentence holds the most weight. No one spoke for a long mile, and then my mom started, not with congratulations, but with a soft scold about how families do not keep secrets on days like this, which sounded almost funny considering the secret I had been asked to keep about a boat that had somehow been rebranded as a need, and my dad asked about numbers and requirements and whether this meant I would not need to borrow from them after all. A question so perfectly shaped to protect his pride that I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing, and I answered that the award covered what mattered and that the university would handle the rest, which was accurate and also exactly the level of detail I was willing to offer. The ceremony itself moved like every ceremony does, with long lines and names called and a sun that made people squint, while my parents rearranged themselves into a version of proud that photographed well. And I let them have their angles because I was not there to humiliate anyone, I was there to end a story. Yet, even in that crowd there were small collisions that told the truth. Like the dean who shook my father's hand and thanked him for raising a student who did not quit when things got hard, a sentence my dad accepted as proof of his own sacrifice, and the professor who hugged my mother and whispered that the billboard made her cry, which my mother received like a compliment on her taste rather than an indictment of her priorities. After the recessional, my brother suggested, in the way he suggests everything, that we swing past the eastbound turn so he could get a photo of the billboard for his feed, and I said we could, but only if we stopped for one picture that mattered to me first. And I led them to the small lawn outside the communications office where the coordinator waited with a clipboard and a smile, and I thanked her in front of them for making the placement work and for adjusting the copy in exactly the way I asked. And when my mom's head snapped toward me at the word placement, I held her gaze and told her, gentle and plain, that I chose that route because it is the one they always take and because it felt right that the first time they saw the truth it would be on the road they used to go celebrate other people, which was the closest I came to a speech all day. They wanted to talk on the drive back, to retell the last few months in a way that made their choices sound thoughtful and my choices sound impulsive, and I let them wind themselves into that familiar loop before I cut in, still calm, and said that I did not need repayment plans or explanations or a new version of the word unstable, that I needed them to understand that I would not be asking again and that I was fine, truly fine, because I had learned how to secure what I needed without making anyone small, and that the only thing I would not allow anymore was a public story that erased the work I did. So if they wanted to post photos they could, but they would not add captions about sacrifice or how we pulled together as a family. Because it would be a lie and I was done donating my silence to lies. We passed the billboard one more time and no one pretended they had not seen it, and when my brother asked again about lunch at the marina, I told him to go without me because I had plans with friends who had shown up for me when it counted. And my mom opened her mouth to object and then closed it, and my dad said something about timing and priorities and then fell quiet, and in that lull I felt the click of a lock sliding into place, not dramatic, just final, a line drawn without shouting, and I knew that they could keep the boat and the narratives that came with it, and I would keep the thing I had built with my own hands and patience, which was a life that did not depend on their sudden urges or their sudden regrets. And as I turned onto the road that would take me away from the marina and toward the small party my friends had arranged, I looked straight ahead and let the silence sit where applause would have been, because I did not need cheering to know I had one. I only needed the clean, quiet knowledge that the last move had been mine, and that it landed exactly where it was meant to land.